Hello, this is Vivi,
And this is Julia.
and welcome back to another episode of Sharing the Caring City. As you can see, today I have in the studio another of our Urban Femina members. She's Julia, as said, and she's also part of our master's program, and she's part of the practice track. So she's not taking classes currently in University of Copenhagen, such as some of us. She is now making an exchange program in the Malmö University, and she's going to talk about a topic that she's been researching on. So, Julia, I give the voice to you, please.
Thanks, BB. Okay, so today we also have two guests who I'm going to be introducing in a bit. But I thought it would be helpful to give a little bit of a roadmap of what we're talking about today, and then how it relates back to urban femina and urbanism and all these things. So yeah, today we're talking about like what is the role of men in feminism from our perspectives and how we understand it, and also how this relates to the urban, to cities, to our experiences in cities, how we shape cities, all these kinds of things. So first I'm gonna have a little chat with Vivi about urban planning and shaping the city and the kind of norms that we have. And then we're going to bring in two of my dear friends from Cape Town, and we're going to reflect on how we kind of nurture certain kinds of masculinities. And then we're going to connect that back to the role of men and creating caring and inclusive cities for everyone. So I'm going to start off with a really interesting example that I came across in a paper that I'm reading for one of my courses at Malmö University, which is about how we design and plan cities is very much shaped by the norms that we sort of carry in our minds about how we see the world, how we experience the world. And a really concrete example was in this paper by these two Swedish scholars who I obviously can't pronounce, called Nilsson and Janke. And so they gave this example of this Swedish insurance company and how it did research on car companies and car like insurance of cars. And they found that women in the driver's seat were 3 times more likely to suffer from whiplash than men. And this study was done in like the late 2000s, and there was another one, a similar one in the States that was done, which found like similar data. And then they speculated that, the conclusions that they came to from this study was that the contributing factors that resulted in women being far more affected by car crashes than men was like the shape of the car seats, and then the sort of state of of crash like test dummies. So like the fake men that are in the car when they test if car crashes will support people, and like seatbelts and that kind of stuff. And essentially they trace this back to the fact that cars are like the safety measures in cars are modeled on like men's biomedical standards. So like the strength in like a sort of average man's neck and bones, and their like height and this kind of stuff. And so ultimately the way these safety measures were designed was designed in a way that supported men and not really with women in mind. And this kind of goes back to the normative idea of man and how that represents like humankind in general. And it represents this sort of blind spot that obviously, like when people design cars, they don't want to not protect half of the human population who are driving, but it's sort of like they're blindsided by certain things that are normal. Another example of like normative ways that we plan was it's like a viral video that came on a while ago on the internet about because TV sensors and then like sensors are designed based on bright colors and light skin. There's this video of this black man putting his hand under a soap dispenser and the soap dispenser not working, and it sort of like highlights that design is made in ways that like accommodate certain people and often unintentionally exclude others. Yeah, so then it's this provocation of how do we, as like people with our own positionality and like backgrounds, who aren't always aware of all these other experiences, whether it's disability or class or race or gender, how we design cities that are inclusive for people. And of course there's this discourse of like, of course we need to include everyone in the conversation, we need to ask people what they need and this kind of stuff. But it's all very well for us to have conversations. So for example, Urban Femina is a group of 9 women in our class, and we're having these conversations of like, what does it mean to be a woman in the city and shaping cities and this kind of stuff. But then if men are also shaping cities, like where are men in this conversation?
Yeah, as we were talking recently with Julia, we always repeat ourselves over and over that feminism is a conversation that should also include men, because we live in a patriarchy system that not only affects women but also affects men. And there is a concept very vital in the feminist conversation that is called intersectionality. So each factor that determines our lives, such as age, such as socioeconomical status, will affect us in different ways. That will make that reality affects us in different ways. And in the end, we were like concluding that the system is, and the things, the built environment, even public policies, have been designed by a specific sector of the population that in academia is referred as the Western man, white, high class guy. So where are the others' perspectives? Where are the others' visions? Recently, I followed the work of a Spanish academic. She is also the director of opinion of El País, like a Spanish newspaper, very important one. And she revisited for her master's thesis the work of Marion Young, and she used to be a philosopher, and also she worked in the urban department in a university in the States. So Marion Young made a reply to John Rawls, who is a theorist of social justice, and for him, he said that justice is the fair equality of opportunity, and it has to be with how the wealth is distributed. So for him, the justice is about redistributing the wealth within the society. So in the end, Marion Young asks, like, why not, instead of talking about an economic distribution, why don't we talk about a distribution of care? Like, instead of putting the eye on what we possess, we put the eye on how we are treated. So in the end, this author and also the Spanish editor of El País, of the newspaper, they remind us that we live in this world shaped by Western men. So in the end, all the decisions affect us in different ways. And again, it's putting the accent that also men that don't belong to that sphere should participate. But again, like from Urban Femina, we have always had these talks that we don't want to, same as feminists ask men not to talk about women, not to talk for women. Of course, we cannot talk for men, but we want to invite them to this conversation.
Cool, thanks, Vivi. And then also to just develop on what Vivi was saying, I think that a lot of men that I know or speak to often find that feminism, or generally on the internet, feminism is sort of a bit of a hot potato, and I think that often men feel like they don't know if they can like enter like feminist spaces, or if they act or feel like maybe they do things that are not very feminist, or if they're not sort of sure about that, maybe they're a bit like afraid to ask or to speak up or whatever, because I think a lot of the time, especially on the internet, people really get shut down about a lot of things and just sort of told like, you're a bad patriarchal sexist man, and then that doesn't really help anyone in like starting conversations or enabling people to see that, at least I think the way that Urban Femina has been discussing feminism is that it's really about how do we create like caring cities and caring societies that are nurturing spaces for everyone regardless of their gender. and and I think that it's really important then that we also have every gender as part of the conversation. Um, so on that note, um, we're gonna have a song played by by Sarita, who's our DJ of our radio. And then I'm going to introduce onto the show two of my very good friends from Cape Town. Um, and I'm thinking I'll introduce them afterwards. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Would it be better now?
yeah.
Okay.
Maybe afterwards we come to you, and also don't forget to follow T-Radio in the social media, and also to participate in the chat. There is a chat, a live chat, where you can give any kind of comment, and we would also like to reflect and to invite you to let us know your perspective about like if feminism is also for men. So please leave your comments. We will be more than delighted to read them.
And also, we'd like to make a special shout out to Dylan, Ola, our friend.
Our friend from
Thanks
the
for listening.
program.
Big shout out there.
Perfect. So, do you want to introduce Sarita's song, or you want me to do it?
Okay, I can do it.
Okay.
I quickly find it.
Okay.
Okay, so as if you've been listening to previous episodes, Sarita is our DJ, and she has been making an exclusively sort of feminine playlist of people who identify as women who make music. So today she's made a selection of South African women artists. The first song is a song called Normalizo by Letambulu, and it's about dreaming bigger in the city, about moving from the countryside to the golden city, and Sarah says it's sublimely sung by this great singer.
So, welcome back to Sharing the Caring City. Actually, talking about this necessity of bringing men into the feminist conversation. Within my readings and everything, I found the work of a Peruvian writer called Jaime Rodriguez Zet. And he actually lives in Madrid, and he actually has a polygamous relationship with two female journalists as well. So it's very interesting how he has been challenging his way of living also, and also his from his work he's also continuously challenging this given masculinity. Sorry. So he has been developed some workshops to try to analyze and unravel the iconic male characters in literature and in mythology, because he says he identifies that also what is there in literature has also influenced the idea of having these heroic and brave men. So actually, there is a chronicle that he wrote for Vice in Spanish, unfortunately, but I can still share it in the chat, about how he had COVID, so he was in the hospital, and he was continuously reflecting on how his masculinity of being brave was stopping him to receive care when he was almost dying, because of course his breathing and heart levels went super low because of COVID. So in the end, it's, I mean, like the masculinities and this idea of how a man has to be is so interiorized within society that even if it can be risky in healthy terms, in health terms, in physical and also mental. So I was talking to Jules about that, and we were even wondering if the life expectancy of men is lower than women, not only because they are the ones supposedly to be in the public realm the whole time, but also because they might not have interiorized this speech of caring and letting be cared. So what do you think about that, Jules?
Yeah, I also read a study by Yale's Public Health School on how skin cancer is a really interesting example of reflecting on these how men have internalized or not notions of care, and whether they like take on care or ask for help, because skin cancer affects men and women with equal incidence, yet men are 2 or 3 times more likely to die as a result of skin cancer, because they generally don't go to the doctor to get checked out until it's too late. And we just thought this was a really another really interesting example of how it reflects on us as a society, and obviously we're speaking to many different societies, and the study was probably done in the US, but I think that these kind of like patriarchal norms and expectations of different forms of masculinities is definitely something we see around the world in different forms. So I've brought in two guys from my hometown, Cape Town, who I think have I've had a lot of conversations over the years with them about what it is to be a man, what it is to be a woman, what it means to be a white person in South Africa, sort of these different intersections of our identity, and how that leads us to experience and interact with people in different ways. So I and in following this idea of like, how do we get men on board in the conversation of feminism, and why bother, why do men maybe want to consider feminism as something that is actually a useful heuristic or a useful thing to think about or take on as a set of values. And so we're asking today Alex to say, are they muted now? Are you unmuted to the show? Okay, so this is Alex and James. Now we can see them there. Uh-huh. Alex has a background in thinking about different forms of care, whether through like public health or global health and psychology. And James we studied anthropology together, and and yeah, I think I'll maybe let you introduce yourself a little bit more if you like, or I will let you simply dive into the question that I'm going to pose to you, which is, so both James and Alex went to single-sex schools in South Africa, and single-sex schools, so boys-only schools, are quite a typical thing, especially with more elite schools in South Africa. And they're associated sometimes, or often, with quite a sort of intense form of patriarchal masculinity, and they can be quite colonial sort of styles of schooling. So I wanted to bounce to them if they could reflect a little bit on how they were kind of taught to be men in these schools, and then at a later stage to reflect on like, how has that understanding of masculinity and how we nurture ourselves changed until now. But that's a very long question because I'm a terrible interviewer, so I will prompt you along the way.
Thanks. Well, happy to be here. Thanks for inviting us.
Thanks for you for coming and for participating.
So James, you want to go first? Or?
Sure, yeah. So, yeah, the school I went to, as Julia explained, is all boys, quite a fancy place. We had this very like strong identity of what it meant to belong to this school. Like it was kind of like this very, very and we were all very proud of it. And there were all these kind of like the symbol of our school was an eagle, and there were eagle statues all over the school. And whenever you walked past an eagle, you touched its heart. And it was like this symbolic, like kind of reaffirming all the time of your belonging to this community. And in some ways that was a positive thing, but in the terms of the way we were taught to be men and kind of like the ideals of masculinity in that space, they were often enforced by kind of like ridicule. And so as soon as you stepped out of line with regards to like appropriate ways to behave, and these were very gendered and like what it meant to be a man and stuff like that, you were often made fun of. And it doesn't doesn't sound like a particularly violent thing. There's not that much kind of like physical violence, but kind of like there's this constant undermining of any sort of experimentation or kind of like divergence from a particular norm. So a particular way in which that would happen is if you kind of showed certain kinds of sensitivity, or did things that, so for example, the sports you played, so if you played rugby, which is this intense physical, like masculine sport, that had kind of like a higher sense of respect than all the boys who played hockey. And they're kind of like the nickname that were given to all the hockey teams was kind of like alluding to the fact that they were all gay kind of thing. So there was like this clear idea of what it meant to be a man. But what I found interesting about it was it was never clearly articulated, and there was never like a clear, like from the kind of like the official school structure of like kind of an idea that they had to guide us through this process of what it meant to be a man. Instead, it kind of happened amongst the boys themselves. Like we kind of figured out for ourselves what it meant, and there was never like kind of a strong mentorship process because there were plenty of male teachers in the school, but there was never a kind of like clear idea of helping us to figure out what it meant and do this in a healthy way. Instead, it was left up to us to kind of like beat each other into shape, which didn't always work very well.
So, and just I suppose to summarize James's point with the insight from a very prominent black radical feminist, Bell Hooks, says that the first requirement of patriarchy is not to direct violence against women, but it's to first engage in a kind of psychic self-mutilation and kill off the emotional parts of yourself. And if you aren't successful in doing that, you can count on other men to do that for you. And so, yes, there wasn't a clear image of what the ideal man was in a school that was communicated very clearly. But in my experience, I always resisted that kind of model of aggression or hardness or an unfeeling, stoic orientation to life. And I was targeted consistently throughout high school because of my displays of emotional sensitivity or artistic curiosity or the fact that I had relationships with women. And that is possibly the interesting sociological component of that. So how boys police each other into a certain kind of norm that isn't communicated, but is nonetheless there.
Yeah, very revealing what you're telling to us, to be honest, because like this idea of the emotions mutilation, like it's very important how, in the sense of, you already mentioned it, like how you taught how to be a man. That is one of the precepts. So, for instance, we have a comment of one of our colleagues in Barcelona, and she says that her husband from Australia, he had to hide the fact that he was an under-16 ping pong champion from his rugby playing friends. So his so his masculinity even like let him do those kind of things, no? And I mean, before we go on with the conversation that we're having now, I would like to make another break to introduce another song. This song is all about emotions, actually, about the pride of the African continent and the voices that were against the apartheid. So this song is called the Click Song #1 by the legendary Miriam Makeba. She was born in 1932 by Johannesburg, and also like remind that this is part of Sarita's selection. So thanks a lot. Let's go to the next song.
So before we go on with any conversations, we actually just wanted to give a shout out to another radio show that is happening directly after ours by City, and it's called How to Dane, and she'll also be talking about different aspects of feminism. So if you want to continue this conversation there, then definitely just keep listening after our show. So to continue our conversation, and to start linking and thinking about how this relates back to the urban, I wanted to think about how these forms of masculinity that are taught, and where you might start in as a very young boy to be told to be strong, to be tough, to not cry, and how that potentially leads to much more insidious forms of violence. And so James and I, when we were chatting about this show yesterday, we were actually talking about gender-based violence and the notion of consent. And I was really struck by, actually, I'm going to just pass the ball to you and about notions of consent.
Yeah. So the idea of kind of, when you think about urban planning, you've got people making decisions about how space is going to be used, who can live and move in certain ways in particular spaces. And if you're kind of trained in a particular way of being in the world, and one that's often centered on kind of like a particular way of responding to stuff from a particular perspective, and if you've never been trained to think from the perspective of other people, then you're going to have these blind spots.
Exactly.
that you've already described. And a big problem with this kind of like, you can talk about it in terms of care, like we haven't been taught to design in a kind of caring way. And so you design for a norm, and then you end up leaving things out. For example, one of the examples we talked about was street lighting. Street lighting is a really important security thing, but it has particularly strong implications for women in public space. If you kind of can't walk home at night and kind of like feel that people can see you or something like that, then you're much more vulnerable to kind of like violence in public space. And these kind of things get left out of the discussion often because they're not necessarily part of the experience of people who are making the planning decisions. So that's one element of it.
Yeah, actually, you made me remind James about another colleague of me in my bachelor's. She also made 4 cities, and her BA thesis was about also the city, reflecting on Mexico City, and she was questioning herself why a place full of possibilities, such as the city and the urban, could be also a place so violent. And in the end, violence is there, like represented in the built environment and also in the way we behave between each other, in the way we interact. And those are things happening in the city. So in the end, justice and violence and masculinities and care are like have everything to do with the city. I would like to know your perspective as well, Alex.
Well, so just a shout out to I think Claire, who shared a link to a book called Invisible Woman, just to reiterate the theme we've been discussing on. I may get the study wrong, but during snowfall, intense snowfall, obviously you have an increase in accidents because roads and sidewalks are slippery. So the city administration first cleared off the snow on highways because people needed to get to work. But they noticed that the hospital cases or hospitalizations were injured women and children. And so I thought, okay, well, that's strange. Let's first clear the sidewalks and the side roads because children are walking to school, women are going to visit their parents or maintain some kind of social ties with one another. And when the city cleared away the snow on the sidewalks and the side roads, hospitalizations dramatically decreased. And so here's another example of taking into account the ordinary and everyday experiences of women into a planning procedure.
And what about the male experiences? In which ways have you identified that the built environment and the public policies affect your everyday life? Can you give an example, share an experience?
I don't know if it's so much a direct experience, but it's based on a direct experience. In the kind of training that you get, this kind of subtle social training you get on what it means to be a man, a very kind of like there's a strong focus on kind of responses of like anger and things like that, and because emotionality and like having kind of complex emotional responses is not appropriate in this kind of like ideal masculine image. Things like shame and uncertainty and stuff like that often kind of like turn into anger very quickly. And we get trained into this idea that violence is an appropriate, like quick way to respond to things. And so that's something that's been a part of my life, is this kind of like unlearning of like an anger response. Because anger has its healthy manifestations, but like it has its time and place. It can't be the only thing that comes to the front all the time. And in planning, you've got kind of, if the decisions that are made around like how urban space is designed are kind of like within a particular framework of understanding how to respond to certain situations, especially with governance and things like that, you limit the ways in which you can respond to situations because you've got a kind of a much smaller palette of options.
I think that's a really interesting comment, and it also links back to some work that I'm doing in Malmö University. We're doing a study on how you care for perpetrators of gender-based violence. And I think it links a lot to this conversation because often when we deal with gender-based violence and domestic violence, there's a lot of focus on the survivors and the victims of violence, which is of course really important to put resources towards caring for people who have gone through huge traumas. But even so, for example, we're looking at gender-based violence in Denmark, and Denmark is really sort of seen by the world, I think, as a really sort of gender equal and really perfect society. But like every place, it has its like fair share of different forms of sexual violence, and so in the surveys about this, they're in the thousands, and then of the people who report, it's like in the hundreds, and then of those convicted of crimes, it's even smaller. So that's sort of everywhere. But how I think this really is connected is that the Danish government funds a program for perpetrators of various forms of domestic violence who self-report. So say I'm a man and I love my wife very much or my partner very much, but sometimes I'm angry and I feel stressed at work and dehumanized by my boss and frustrated that I can't bring food to the table and all this sort of stuff, which are like still stereotypes that are expected of men. And I lash out and hit my wife, or I'm pushy or whatever. And I know that I'm not supposed to do that as a man or as a human to my partner. And then there's an intense shame around that. But you can't sort of go talk about that because everyone knows you're not supposed to hit your wife or whatever. But then the government here, and I think everywhere, doesn't have enough programs and enough spaces or treatment programs for those people to receive care, to receive treatment, to find ways to channel that anger in different ways. And it's this balance of then finding the resources to fund caring programs for perpetrators rather than addressing the people who are affected by that but aren't actually the root of the problem. Because if we keep just giving programs to survivors but not addressing the problem, which is the sort of, I think my understanding is that it's the structural circumstances and the environments that shape men to act in certain ways, that shape all of us to act in certain ways. And often it's based on these like values that we learn from a very young age in school. And another concrete example is that there's a hotline in Denmark that you can call if you are involved in gender-based violence or domestic violence in any way. And on the FAQs of the website, there are 9 questions for survivors, for people who are like, do I deserve to be beaten, or these sort of things. And only 1 question, which is addressing what do I do if I have violent behavior. So how do we now reach the people who are also needing help as people, you know, to not like perpetuate things.
Yeah, actually, you made me remind about the case of Mexico. There is a researcher. She's Mexican, but she's working in the University of Bristol. I can also share her name, Karina Garcia Reyes. And she also shed light with her work and the perspective of the perpetrators. She had an interview with 33 ex-drug dealers that were in prison. And all of them always mentioned this idea of how she analyzed how they always refer to this idea of the individuality, how their mindset and their behavior was affected by this neoliberal speech that is like super interiorized within the Mexican population since the 80s because of the since the economic strategies that started to be taken by then. So in the end, these persons refer to their neighborhoods in the city as jungles, where they had to learn how to defend themselves. Like they had very in mind that they had to take care of themselves. So in the end, we go back to this lack of caring strategies from public people, and from also they are the ones that are designing the strategies based on their own mindset, but they are not taking into account also the mindset and the life world of the perpetrators and other sectors of the population. So again, like there are a lot of people left out of the conversation.
Thanks, Phoebe. And I think that what Vivi's saying and these examples also highlight, at least for me, make quite clear why values of feminism, like and values of like the caring city paradigm, so a paradigm where so the idea that cities should take into account the needs of all different kinds of users, and so yeah, so if sorry, I lost my train of thought.
No worries.
But in the sense of this care, like men, we all know men also need care. People identifying as men also need care, and I think that this caring city paradigm that urban feminists kind of been playing with a lot has really highlighted that.
What do you think of going to our next song, and then we come back to you, so you share again your perspectives with us guys. So the third song that we're going to play is called Bully Ndla by Brenda Fassie, and she became a black pop icon in a racist apartheid society. That's why Sarita also chose it, so let's listen to it.
Hopefully everyone can hear us. So I also want to draw back to Bell Hooks, who's a very well-known feminist writer. And she also has said it is urgent that men take up the banner of feminism and challenge patriarchy. The safety and continuation of life on the planet requires feminist conversation of men. And I hope that maybe our conversations have sparked some ideas or something like that about notions of care and caring for everyone, and the importance of getting people on board with being aware of like their positionality when designing public spaces, for instance, in order to ensure that we're being aware of our blind spots, and not only making car security features for people with very strong necks. And with that, I wanted to throw our last sort of question back to the guys about what do you think? What is the role of people gendered as men? How do we get men into the conversation? Is it something we should try to do? Yeah.
So I think for me, what feminism has always meant is that a culture of misogyny is bad for everyone. And it's bad for everyone because we put ourselves in a bind. And the bind is, as social creatures, we want to attach and we need to attach to others to ensure our survival, which is why solitary confinement is a particularly devastating and cruel form of punishment. But also that the conditions that we attach to others in, be they personal, institutional, can also undermine our well-being, health, survivability, flourishing, whatever word you'd like to use. And so, and I can see the way that's played out in my own life, in the shallow intimacy that's often shared initially between, the shallow intimacy that was shared between my early relationships with other men and the intimacy that I've now enjoyed, not just with women, but also with men. And, excuse me, I'm losing my train of thought, but the difficulty is that often strength is a value that's ascribed to masculinity, and that strength means that any admission of pain or suffering is seen as a sign of weakness, which goes against that ideal. And so I think cultivating a sense of gentleness and sensitivity as being essential features of what it means not just to be a good man, but what it means to be an ethical person, can partly shift the narrative and allow men to speak about the experience of violence which they've had. And there are some small sort of hopeful signs of change. I mean, there's an interesting project in South Africa called the Mankind Project, which is trying to build a conception of masculinity that doesn't demean strength and doesn't demean the sort of protective drive that many men have, but also fosters an idea that men can also be nurturers, men can also be carers. And so I think if projects like that are given sort of airtime or given support, that I think will be something useful to try and change a culture of misogyny that we otherwise inherit.
What about your thoughts, James?
Yeah, yeah. Kind of my personal experience is that there are very few spaces in which we can really learn to care as men, and there's very little kind of like motivation amongst our peers to kind of like hold each other, kind of care for each other, but also hold each other accountable in a kind of gentle, kind of nurturing way, where we can really learn amongst each other healthy masculinity. And we don't have these, well, kind of we're not supported in developing these skills, and so of course we're going to bring that into our professional lives when it comes to the planning of urban spaces, the designing of urban features and things like that. We're much less likely to bring this kind of like rich resource of care to our jobs, because the world has kind of put us into this position where that's not something that is valued in us, our ability to care and be supportive of others. And so, yeah, it's kind of like the the thing that's required of men in some ways that could really support kind of a feminist agenda, both in kind of like the urban world and just generally, is to take this idea of care really seriously and really like interrogate the spaces in your life in which you feel cared for, in which you feel able to give care, and kind of bring your male friends into this conversation and kind of support each other in this journey of developing a language and repertoire of care.
Yeah, thanks a lot for sharing that. To be honest, like you give us a lot of hope, and also you are like a proof that these conversations are already happening within men, and that you are really aware of this. I mean, I know that not all men think like you, of course, but it's good to know that there are out there men that are really aware of this and know the importance about feminism, and also the importance of starting having these conversations amongst you. So thank you so much.
Cool, yeah, and yeah, I think we're always in this process of learning and unlearning these things, and I think that it's exciting as a group of Femina having conversations about what does it mean to be a person in different spaces, and how our positionalities affect these spaces, and I think part of my thinking of like bringing men into this show, and I think it's sort of controversial sometimes to like bring men into feminist spaces and blah, 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 but I think it may be similar to the book. It's like Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race. It's also like men also need to be talking about these things when we're talking about gender. And yeah, so it's really wonderful to have these kind of conversations, and to keep processing and growing each of us. Yeah, so thanks everyone for joining us on the show. Thanks Vivi for your
Jules.
hosting. And yeah, post more comments. We'd love to hear your thoughts.